It all started when the HOA decided my little creek didn't fit their idea of community beauty. I had lived on that land for nearly 15 years, long before the developers bought up the surrounding lots and built their expensive homes. Back then, it was quiet and peaceful, a narrow stream winding through oak trees, a few benches along the banks, and the soft sound of running water that made the place feel alive. When the HOA came in, things changed. They called it progress, but it felt more like control. They wanted everything to look uniform: lawns the same shade of green, fences the same height, and no unapproved landscaping features. That included my creek, apparently. The first time they mentioned it was at an HOA meeting I didn't even plan to attend. A neighbor texted me halfway through and said, "Hey, they're talking about your property." I showed up just in time to hear Karen, the HOA president, declare that my creek caused erosion and was visually inconsistent with the neighborhood aesthetic. I stood in the doorway, stunned. "You can't just decide that," I said. "That creek's been here longer than any of you." She gave me that tight, fake smile she always used when she thought she was being diplomatic. "We understand it's sentimental," she said, "but it's becoming an eyesore. The board has voted to take action." At first, I thought she was bluffing. Surely they couldn't touch land that wasn't even under their jurisdiction. My property lines were clearly defined in the county registry, and the creek ran entirely through my lot. But Karen and her little group of clipboard enforcers didn't care about boundaries. A few days later, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery outside. 2 trucks were parked on the edge of my property, and workers in orange vests were unloading rebar and concrete mix. I ran outside, furious, demanding to know what they thought they were doing. One of them shrugged. "We got an order from the HOA. Said we're supposed to reinforce the drainage here." I told them to stop immediately, but Karen herself showed up moments later, clipboard in hand and arrogance in full display. "You can't interfere with a community improvement project," she snapped. "We're addressing a runoff issue." I pointed to my fence line. "That's my land," I said. "You're trespassing." She rolled her eyes. "It's not about ownership, it's about safety and aesthetics. The creek is unregulated water flow. We're just stabilizing it." Before I could argue further, the cement truck's engine roared to life. I called the sheriff's office right then, but by the time a deputy arrived, they had already poured several loads of concrete into the stream bed. The clear, bubbling water was gone, replaced by gray sludge hardening under the morning sun. The deputy looked uncomfortable, caught between HOA politics and property law. "Technically, sir," he said, "if they cross the property line, you can file a complaint, but that's a civil matter, not criminal." He handed me a card for the county environmental department and left. Karen stood there smirking like she'd already won. I filed every complaint I could. Environmental, zoning, trespassing, you name it. But government bureaucracy moves slowly, and by the time anyone from the county came to inspect, the damage was done. The entire creek bed was filled, and the natural water flow had been diverted into a makeshift culvert that ran behind several houses. Karen proudly sent out a community email calling it a successful drainage improvement. Everyone applauded her for protecting property values. I just watched in silence, seething, as rainwater that used to trickle harmlessly through my land started backing up near their manicured lawns. A few weeks later, the first storm hit. It wasn't anything major, just a steady summer downpour, but the new drainage system couldn't handle it. The culvert overflowed, water pooling at the base of the hill behind the houses. By nightfall, several backyards had turned into muddy ponds. I watched from my porch as homeowners scrambled outside with sandbags and buckets. Karen came knocking on my door the next morning, soaked and angry. "Your old creek flooded my property," she yelled. "You're responsible for this." I laughed out loud. "My creek didn't flood anything. You filled it with concrete, remember?" She threatened to sue me, of course. She said the water was naturally redirected and that my land was causing obstruction. But the county inspector, when he finally arrived, told a different story. He looked over the mess, took photos, and shook his head. "Whoever did this violated multiple environmental regulations," he said. "You can't just fill a natural waterway." I pointed at the HOA sign down the street. "Talk to them," I said. The investigation took months, but the evidence was undeniable. The HOA had not only trespassed on private land but also tampered with the registered water feature. The fines were astronomical, tens of thousands for environmental damage, improper permits, and illegal construction. Karen tried to deflect blame, claiming it was a miscommunication, but everyone knew she had personally signed the contractor's paperwork. The irony was almost poetic. The HOA that prided itself on protecting property values had just destroyed them. The worst part for them came later that year when the rains returned. Without the natural creek to guide runoff, the entire lower section of the neighborhood began to sink. Lawns turned to mush, driveways cracked, and basements started flooding. One by one, homeowners filed insurance claims, only to learn that man-made alterations to drainage voided their coverage. The HOA's fund dried up almost overnight. People started turning on Karen, demanding she step down, but she refused, insisting that I had sabotaged their system. I stayed quiet through all of it. There was no need to argue. Nature was doing the talking for me. The county eventually ordered a full restoration of the creek and sent contractors to dig out the concrete. They tore up several sections of road just to reroute the water properly, and in the process, half the neighborhood's landscaping was ruined. The total repair cost nearly $1 million. The HOA tried to levy a special assessment to cover it, but most residents refused to pay. The once pristine subdivision that Karen had fought so hard to control was now a patchwork of flooded lawns, dead trees, and muddy puddles. The day the county officially restored my creek, I stood by the water's edge and watched it flow freely again. It wasn't as deep as it used to be, but it was alive. The sound of it was like music after months of silence. A few neighbors stopped by, embarrassed, to apologize. One of them said, "We should listen to you." I just nodded. The land always wins, I told them. As for Karen, she eventually resigned and sold her house at a massive loss. Rumor had it she moved to another HOA community a few towns over, probably to start the same chaos all over again. But here, things finally went back to the way they were meant to be. The creek ran clear, the birds came back, and peace settled over the valley once more. Every time I look out across that water, I remember how they tried to bury it and how, in the end, it buried them instead. The storm that finally exposed the HOA's arrogance wasn't even a hurricane or anything dramatic. It was just 3 days of relentless rain that soaked the valley and turned their perfect lawns into swamps. After they poured concrete into my creek, I had warned them that water always finds its way. They laughed, thinking they de-engineered nature into submission. But as the rain came down in sheets, the new drainage system they were so proud of began to choke. The culvert they installed couldn't carry the runoff fast enough, and soon, water was spilling over the sides, racing downhill straight toward their million-dollar homes. I watched from my porch as it started to happen, a slow, creeping flood that no one could stop. It was almost poetic. The same people who called my natural creek an eyesore were now surrounded by the very thing they tried to erase: mud, water, and chaos. By the second day, the HOA's emergency group chat was full of panic. Neighbors were posting pictures of backyards that looked like small ponds. One message from Karen stood out: "We need volunteers to help reinforce the drainage area behind lots 7 to 12. I didn't respond, of course. Why would I? They had made it clear that my input wasn't welcome when they buried the creek. Instead, I stood under my umbrella and took photos of the water pooling behind their fences, creeping closer to their back doors. By sunset, the streets were half submerged. A couple of residents tried using sandbags, but it was pointless. Without the creek's natural outlet, the water had nowhere to go but in. That night, the first basement flooded. The Johnsons, who lived 3 houses down from Karen, woke up to find water seeping through their floorboards. Their sump pump couldn't keep up, and within an hour, everything was floating: boxes, furniture, even their kids' toys. They called the HOA, furious, demanding immediate help. Karen, ever the control freak, assured them she was coordinating with the county. That was a lie. The county had already issued a storm advisory warning against exactly what they had done: tampering with natural waterways without permits. But Karen didn't tell anyone that. She just sent out another email telling residents to remain calm and limit unnecessary water usage. By the third morning, the smell hit. Stagnant water mixed with mud, fertilizer, and sewage created a stench that hung in the humid air. People couldn't even open their windows. The HOA maintenance crew, which was basically 2 teenagers with shovels, tried to clear the blocked culvert, but the water pressure was too strong. I watched as one of the workers slipped and nearly got pulled into the rushing current. That's when I knew things were about to get worse. Sure enough, by noon, one of the main retaining walls behind Karen's house cracked. I heard it from across the property: a sharp, echoing snap followed by a low rumble. Then came the collapse. Tons of mud and water rushed down into her backyard, taking her perfect rose bushes and patio furniture with it. Karen's screams echoed through the rain. I could see her standing on her porch, phone in hand, yelling at someone, probably the county, demanding they fix it. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the smug look on her face the day she poured concrete into my creek. She had told me it was for the good of the community. Now her community was knee-deep in the consequences of her arrogance. I heard the distant sound of sirens, and soon the fire department showed up with pumps and hoses, trying to redirect the flood water. They parked their trucks right in front of my property, using my old creek bed as a staging area. One of the firefighters came over and asked, "Wasn't there a stream running through here before?" I nodded. "There was," I said. "Until the HOA decided they knew better." He shook his head and muttered something about stupidity before getting back to work. I couldn't help but notice how efficiently the water still wanted to flow where it used to. The natural channel I'd cared for years was trying to reclaim itself. The firefighters eventually cut a path through the concrete just to get the water moving again. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to relieve the pressure. Karen stood there, drenched and furious, watching them tear apart her so-called drainage improvements. "You can't do that," she yelled. "That's HOA property." The firefighter ignored her completely. "Lady," he said, "if we don't, your whole block's going underwater." By the time the rain stopped, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. Lawns had turned into marshes, driveways were cracked, and several basements were still submerged. The once pristine streets of Oak Ridge Estates looked like a disaster zone. The HOA called an emergency meeting, and though I wasn't required to attend, I showed up anyway. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone was angry at the HOA, at Karen, at the mess they were now stuck with. Karen tried to spin the story, saying the flooding was due to unprecedented weather patterns. But when the county inspector arrived with photos and reports proving the real cause, the room went silent. The documents clearly stated that the HOA's unauthorized construction had blocked a registered waterway, leading directly to the flooding. Someone in the back stood up and shouted, "You destroyed our homes to make the place look pretty." Others started yelling too. Karen's confident facade cracked right there in front of everyone. She stammered about trying to protect property values, but no one was listening. The inspector calmly explained that the HOA would be responsible for all damages and restoration costs. I could almost hear the collective gasp when he said the estimated total over $1 million. That number hit them like a punch. People started turning on Karen immediately, demanding her resignation. One neighbor even said, "We should listen to him," and pointed straight at me. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Nature had done the work for me. The HOA's greed and arrogance had literally flooded them out. In the following weeks, they tried to sue the contractors, the county, even me, but none of it went anywhere. The evidence was too clear. Their negligence had caused everything. The county ordered a full environmental restoration, meaning they had to dig out every inch of the concrete and rebuild the creek bed exactly as it was before. They weren't happy about it, but they had no choice. I watched as crews spent months tearing up their precious landscaping and hauling away truckloads of debris. The sound of machinery was constant, but this time, I didn't mind. It was the sound of justice. When it was finally over, the land looked raw but clean, ready to heal. The water began to flow again, just like it used to. Birds came back, frogs returned, and the air smelled fresh for the first time in months. The homeowners were left with empty wallets, cracked foundations, and a broken HOA that no one trusted anymore. Karen resigned quietly, disappearing from the neighborhood gossip chain. I heard she sold her house at a massive loss and moved somewhere far away. The irony of it all still makes me smile. They tried to control nature, but nature doesn't bend to committees or covenants. It does what it's meant to do. Now, when I walk along the edge of my property and hear the creek running again, it feels like a victory not just for me, but for the land itself. I didn't have to fight them in court or argue at meetings. All I had to do was wait, because karma, like water, always finds its way home. When the flood maps were finally updated, it was like the universe had handed me the ultimate punchline. The same HOA board that once bragged about building a flood-resistant luxury community suddenly found itself sitting on land officially reclassified as a floodplain. Their million-dollar homes were now worth half that, if not less. I remember the moment I first got the report. The county sent a notice to every property owner, including me, explaining that after the creek disaster and the massive restoration efforts, the area's water flow had been permanently altered. My land, sitting slightly higher and untouched by their foolish development, was now marked as safe ground, while everything beyond the original creek bed, the HOA's precious subdivision, was marked as at risk. It was poetic justice written in bureaucratic ink. The neighborhood that tried to erase nature had literally drowned itself in paperwork and water. Karen, of course, couldn't accept it. Even though she had been forced to step down from the HOA presidency, she still acted like she ran the place. Rumor had it she'd been trying to convince the new board to appeal the flood zoning, but the county officials had made it clear, the damage was done. No amount of landscaping or new drainage could undo what they'd done when they poured concrete into a natural creek. Their foundation cracks, mold issues, and rising insurance costs were now permanent reminders of their arrogance. Meanwhile, my land value had actually gone up. The restored creek had made my property a small ecological haven, clean water, birds nesting nearby, and wildflowers returning to the banks. What they saw as a swamp, I saw as nature healing itself. One afternoon, a real estate agent knocked on my door. She introduced herself politely and asked if I'd consider selling part of my property. Apparently, several homeowners in the subdivision wanted to buy higher ground for future development, or at least as backup land for potential flood mitigation. I almost laughed in her face, but I didn't. Instead, I invited her to the porch, poured her a glass of water, and said calmly, "Tell them I'm not interested in selling, but I'll lease the land for environmental use at market rate." She smiled awkwardly, knowing exactly what that meant. Within a week, the HOA reached out formally, asking if I'd consider partnering with them on a new drainage improvement project. They wanted to reroute runoff water through my creek again, as if it hadn't been theirs to begin with. I responded with 2 words: absolutely not. Their desperation grew over time. One day, I found a letter in my mailbox, unsigned but clearly from someone in the HOA, begging me to reconsider. It said the neighborhood's insurance premiums had tripled and some homeowners were facing foreclosure. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and tossed it into the fireplace. They had ignored every warning, dismissed every concern, and now the consequences were eating them alive. I wasn't going to bail them out. The land had its own way of balancing things, and this was one lesson they had to learn the hard way. It wasn't long before reporters showed up. Local news stations had caught wind of the story: a luxury neighborhood built over a buried creek, now condemned to endless flooding. The headline practically wrote itself. They interviewed several residents who blamed poor planning, but no one wanted to name names. Still, the county records were public, and Karen's signature was all over the permits. She couldn't hide from it anymore. Cameras caught her storming out of a meeting, refusing to comment. The footage went viral locally, and soon she became a cautionary tale, a symbol of HOA overreach gone wrong. The rest of the board quietly dissolved, and a few residents started talking about disbanding the HOA altogether. Meanwhile, life on my property had never been better. The air smelled clean again, and the gentle sound of the creek at night was like a lullaby. Wildlife thrived where their concrete walls had once stood. Deer came to drink from the water, herons fished in the shallows, and I even spotted a beaver one evening. It felt like the land had forgiven me for what others had done to it. I'd walk along the banks, remembering how they mocked me for wanting to preserve it. "You're holding the community back," Karen had said once. Now her community was underwater, and I was the only one standing dry. One day, as I was trimming the hedges near the fence line, Karen showed up again. She looked nothing like the woman who used to strut around in tailored suits with her clipboard. Her clothes were rumpled, her eyes tired, and her confidence gone. She stood on the other side of the fence, clutching a soggy stack of papers. "You win," she said quietly. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to gloat, to remind her of every cruel thing she'd said when the HOA fined me for ridiculous violations, but I didn't. She continued, "They're all blaming me, and maybe they're right. I just wanted the place to look good. I didn't think." Her voice trailed off. I finally spoke. "You didn't think nature would fight back?" She looked down, shame flickering in her eyes. I guess I didn't. For the first time, she seemed genuinely human, broken, humbled. The county says we need your permission to rebuild the drainage through your land. Please, just, help us. I looked past her, toward the neighborhood, where a row of expensive homes sat dark and empty. The land was still wet, muddy, and lifeless. I thought about it for a moment and then said, Karen, I already helped when I warned you not to touch the creek. You just didn't listen. She didn't argue. She nodded, turned around, and walked away. That was the last time I ever saw her. She sold her house a few months later for half its original value and disappeared. Some said she moved to another town and started fresh. Others claimed she joined another HOA somewhere else. Either way, she was gone, and good riddance. In the years that followed, the neighborhood never really recovered. Without the HOA's funding or leadership, the roads fell into disrepair, lawns grew patchy, and the once pristine subdivision lost its charm. Ironically, my land became the most desirable spot in the area. The restored creek was now part of a small conservation zone, and environmental groups occasionally visited to study its recovery. What started as a feud over a messy little stream had become a lesson in balance, how greed and control can destroy what patience and respect can preserve. Sometimes I stand on the bridge overlooking the water and think about how easily it all could be gone differently. If they had just listened, if they de-respected what was already here, they could had beauty without destruction. But people like Karen always think they can improve on nature, shape it to their liking. In the end, nature shaped them instead. The creek flows steady now, reflecting the sky like glass. It doesn't rush or rage anymore, it just exists, quietly reclaiming what was always its own. And as for me, I finally have what I wanted all along: peace, solitude, and the satisfaction of knowing that while their million-dollar dreams sank into the mud, I stayed right where I belonged, high and dry above it all.